I'm a specialist in animal ethics and Protestant literature, Protestant Christian literature. So I'm going to be speaking mainly about animals, but I don't think this is a disadvantage for our subject because, as you'll know, the way that we treat animals is both a cause and a marker of many wider issues of sustainability that we see today. Take an example. COP26 ends this week in Scotland, and we know that between 14 and 51% of greenhouse gases is produced by the meat and dairy industries. But it's not just, that's not the only issue of sustainability connected with animals. Pollution, malnutrition of people, water scarcity are all directly linked to animal abuse. I think it's fair to say that if we were to get our relationship with animals right, many more general issues of sustainability would follow. Now, let me start with some common misconceptions about Christianity and animals. In Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, humans are given dominion over the earth, and many contemporary Christians argue that this entitles us to, as Prince Charles puts it, dominate nature rather than live in harmony with it on a sustainable basis. That's Prince Charles's view, the heir to the British throne. In particular, many claim that animals are here for us to eat. So in 1990, John Selwyn Gummer, who was then the British Minister of Agriculture and also a member of the Church of England General Synod, which is its ruling body, denounced vegetarians as, and I quote, wholly unnatural food faddists. He said, "The Bible tells us that we are masters of the fowls of the air and the beasts of the field, and we very properly eat them." Mr. Gummer is now Baron Deben and a member of the House of Lords in the British Houses of Parliament. He's chair of the UK's Committee on Climate Change and works for several conservation and sustainability organisations. So he's a major voice in British politics. And that's his view. Prince Charles agrees with Baron Deben about eating animals, but he laments rather than celebrates what he believes to be the more general implications of dominion. He says, to me, the Old Testament story, that is Genesis, has provided Western man with an overbearing and domineering attitude towards God's creation. It has contributed to a feeling that the world is somehow entirely man's to dispose of. That's Prince Charles. David Clough, the theologian, calls this the "it's all about us" view of the world. This view of dominion is very widespread within contemporary Christian community, and not surprisingly, most people outside that community believe that it's the Christian perspective on sustainability and diet. This includes drivers of public opinion from the animal ethicist Peter Singer to the English naturalist Chris Packham. But before proceeding further, we should note that the text quoted by both Lord Deben and Prince Charles continues by making clear that biblical dominion is vegan. This is hardly the overbearing and domineering attitude towards God's creation which Prince Charles alleges. Moreover, it makes eating animals wholly unnatural, the opposite of Baron Deben's erroneous opinion. It's difficult to understand how such distinguished people could make such egregious errors, but they do. The truth is that it's not all about us, and that the Dominion diet was originally vegan. If, as Baron Deben believes, the original Dominion diet is the criterion for what is natural, then plant-based diets are natural. It is the meat diet which is unnatural. Happily, there are Christians in the UK who have read Genesis and have responded to what the text actually says. These include theologians such as Professor Andrew Lindsay at Oxford University and Professor David Clough at Chester University, who have both written extensively on the subject over many decades. Moreover, the new millennium has seen the emergence of Christian organisations such as SARCs and Creature Kind, which promote the interests of animals. Encouragingly, many of those involved in these organisations are much younger than I am. These more animal-friendly views are not a modern discovery, still less a minority fad. In fact, the opposite is the case. It is the erroneous modern Christian views, such as Baron Devon's, which are the exception in historic Protestant discourse. Indeed, animal-friendly views draw from the biblical text have influenced both dietary reform and environmentalism. And consider just three curious facts, as they run contrary to the popular misconception about Christianity. Firstly, as I've argued in the book Animal Ethics and the Nonconformist Conscience, Protestant Christians drove animal welfare in England for nearly 300 years. From the 17th century legislation preventing attaching a plough to an animal's tail, through the banning of blood sports and protecting domestic animals, to the founding of the RSPCA and the anti-vivisection movement in the earlier 20th century, in the 19th century, Protestant Christians were in the vanguard. Secondly, recent research has shown that these same kinds of Christians were instrumental in driving US environmentalism in the earlier 20th century. And thirdly, the historian Keith Thomas has shown a link between the Protestant teaching on providence and the harmony in creation, which we would now call ecology. In each case, the prime movers were not just Protestants, but a specific group of Protestant Christians, those I call nonconformist. They had in common a rejection of church tradition and a return to the biblical texts as authoritative. And in what follows, I shall use examples from these nonconformist Christians to illustrate that what I'm saying is not simply speaking with the benefit of hindsight. It's important to understand that the biblical creation narrative not only provided for a vegan diet, it also spoke of the world as a harmonious whole, cooperatively working together for the good of all. The text has little sense of ontological hierarchy or instrumental use, such as Aristotle's view, and I quote Aristotle, that plants are created for the sake of animals and animals for the sake of man. You won't find that in Genesis. Rather, the nonconformists found a harmonious creaturely kinship of peace, concord, and mutual preservation. This is not unlike modern ideas of an ecosystem. Musical tropes, musical images predominate. So in 1538, Martin Luther wrote of the harmony not only among men, but also between the dumb animals and men. And in 1641, George Walker said that originally all creatures lived together in love and concord among themselves. For John Calvin in the mid-16th century, this precluded predation and violence. He says there would certainly have been no discord among the creatures of God if they had remained in their first and original condition. Now, I emphasize that I'm not reading back into the biblical text modern ecological understandings. Rather, as Keith Thomas has argued, modern understandings drew on these earlier insights. But Christians who want to eat animals commonly respond by saying that this was true only before the fall. After that, they say, God gave us animals to eat. But this also is incorrect. The fall, by the way, is the name given to that event in the Christian narrative which tells of humans turning away from God in an original act of overconsumption and towards their own anthropocentric interests. The biblical text refers to a new disharmony in creation, which introduced scarcity after the fall, but the diet remained vegan. Christians who are determined to find warrant for eating animals next turn to the flood narrative, which tells of a universal deluge which destroyed all agriculture. Incidentally, we should note that all species were preserved through the flood regardless of their usefulness or harmfulness to humans. The cause of the flood was the spread of a great violence throughout all creation, an extension of the disharmony produced by the anthropocentric exploitation of Eden. From Philip Henry in the mid-17th century to John Gill in the mid-18th, nonconformists spoke of riotous flesh-eaters before the flood, even of cannibalism. But this flesh-eating was roundly condemned and was the consequence of sin. Since human beings were determined to eat animals, the Noahic covenant, the covenant made with Noah after the flood, set out to regulate this and restrict cruelty. Now, here I can only mention the requirement that an animal be drained of blood before it's cooked and eaten. This was a simple way to ensure that it was dead. As Albert Barnes observed in the mid-19th century, exsanguination, the draining of the blood, not only prevents the consumption of living flesh, it will also prevent the horrid cruelty, he says, of mutilating or cooking an animal while yet alive and capable of suffering pain. The draining of the blood from the body is an obvious occasion of death, and therefore the prohibition to eat the flesh of with the blood of life is a necessary restraint from savage cruelty. At this point, Christians who desire to eat meat say triumphantly, "There you are, we have permission to eat animals." But this neglects both the reason for that permission and the restrictions on cruelty which it imposed. First, the permission to eat animals was the result of sin, which had so corrupted our appetite that we unnaturally desire to eat flesh. An unnatural, corrupted appetite is something over which we should mourn, not rejoice. Secondly, permission was given because anthropocentric sin had so destroyed nature's harmony that food scarcity reduced human agriculture to subsistence farming. This made eating animal flesh necessary for survival. We no longer need to subsistence farm in the West, so the agricultural basis for meat eating has gone. Thirdly, as I've mentioned, it's not permitted to eat animals before they are dead. Now, we know that animals in industrial facilities are often butchered before they're dead, either as a result of mechanical failure, boredom, or sadism. The exsanguination rules of the Noahic covenant would close down industrial meat production overnight. In 1641, George Walker condemned cruelty to animals as a kind of scorn and contempt for the workmanship of God our Creator, and for the works of his hand which made us, and an injury which reflects on God's majesty. And we hereby give a just occasion to God, and as it were, invite and provoke him to judge us by our own mouth, and to proceed against us according to the example of our own doings, and to mete out to us by the same measure as we have done to his creatures, the living works of his hands. Next we come to the law given through Moses, and I can only briefly touch on this, but it extends the anti-cruelty provision of the Noahic covenant. Firstly, the Mosaic law distinguished between animals that can be eaten in conditions of scarcity and animals which must not be eaten or harmed even in conditions of scarcity. It sets out a few simple rules to ensure that animals that can only be killed with great cruelty are not eaten. For example, crustacea, commonly boiled to death in the modern world, are protected. So are cephalopods with their distributed nervous system, which nowadays are often dismembered or grilled alive. Similarly, pigs, whose neck arteries are hidden deeply in fat and muscle and are therefore hard to slaughter, are forbidden as food. Secondly, with very few exceptions, all slaughter was religious rather than secular. As a result, slaughter had to be overseen by a priest who refused permission to kill an animal if it were injured or bore any mark of injury. This meant that subsistence farmers had to be very careful to prevent their animals from suffering accidental injuries. It also meant that deliberate mutilations, such as are common in the developed West, were prevented. A farmer could not castrate, tail dock, debeak, dehorn, or brand his animals. Finally, and very briefly, I want to turn to the texts of the New Testament, I can only just sketch this. Firstly, we should note that Jesus affirms the integrity of the Older Testament texts, including the law. This would include the observations I've made about the Noahic and Mosaic covenants. Secondly, animals are present or significantly absent at each stage of Jesus' ministry. Oxen at his birth, a dove at his baptism, wild animals at his temptation, a donkey and a foal at his entry into Jerusalem, and an absent lamb at the Last Supper. The absence of the lamb is significant, of course, because Jesus' institution of the Eucharist, the Christian celebration, was plant-based. John's Gospel suggests that Jesus routinely celebrated Passover without the lamb. Thirdly, Jesus referred positively to animals in his teaching. For example, he affirmed that God cares for sparrows individually, not just collectively, and he rebuked those who count birds of little worth. He often referred to himself as the good shepherd who cares for the sheep rather than the wicked shepherd who eats them. There are many other examples in the Gospels. Fourthly, there is no record that Jesus ate animals. The single clear reference to his eating a piece of fish was after his resurrection. This was not, however, for dietary purposes, but to demonstrate that he was not a ghost. It seems unlikely that any of us will be called upon to prove that we are not a ghost. Finally, after his resurrection, he showed the Apostle John a vision of 4 living creatures worshipping around the throne of God: a lion, an ox, a man, and an eagle, each the head of the fourfold classification of animals in the first century. In doing so, he affirmed the Old Testament theme that all creation, without hierarchy, was created to praise God. Well, in the time allotted, I'll have to bring it to an end there, but I look forward to questions and discussion. So it's back to you, Stefan.
Thank you so much, Philip. And we don't have any questions as yet from the viewers. The idea is to collect it afterwards. But of course, if there is a question, I will bring it up immediately. Maybe one of you other 4 people in the panel has some kind of a reflection or question. Not yet. Yes. Come on, Paula. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I was just thinking when Dr. Philip Sampson talked that I can cut half of my speech, but it's all the Abrahamic religions are connected with the Bible. So it's interesting to notice the similarities. I'm just wondering, I have not heard before about Jesus being a vegetarian, or this is completely new to me.
Okay. Yeah, there are, of course, very many things in common between the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, because we share so many of the scriptures. I'm not sure that I would refer to Jesus as either vegetarian or vegan, because, of course, these are modern terms. Vegetarian from the mid-19th century and vegan from the 1940s. But it's simply the case that there is no record of Jesus ever eating meat in the New Testament. The only record of his eating a piece of fish, a piece of dried fish, was after the resurrection, when people were frightened to see him because he died and now they could see him. So to prove he wasn't a ghost, he asked for something to eat, and they gave him a piece of dried fish, which he ate. But that had nothing to do with diet. It was to prove that he wasn't a ghost. And since I think it's unlikely that any of us will be called upon to prove that we're not ghosts, I think that perhaps is not the most relevant illustration from the life of Jesus.
Okay, Sarah, you had some reflection, I think.
Interestingly, I was going to say both of the things that Paula said. The similarities really blew me away. And this is also the first time I heard that there's no record of Jesus having eaten meat. And that's really quite a phenomenal thing to learn. So thank you for sharing that.